हेलो नमस्कार नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस पर आज के इस विशेष कार्यक्रम में आप सभी का स्वागत है। Today's very special program is dedicated to Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. The entire nature of the program is apolitical. I'll be talking to Netaji's daughter, Professor Anita Bose Pfaff, who has joined me from Germany with her husband, Professor Martin Pfaff. I'm very grateful to her for making time despite a busy day to be the 124th birth anniversary of her illustrious father and the leader who continues to inspire Indians all over the world. Today's session is being chaired by Professor John Eade from the University of Roehampton. He is a well-known anthropologist and the chair of SACF, that is South Asian Cinema Foundation, of which I am the founder director. Suhas Khale, chair of Netaji Subhas Foundation, NSF, also joins me in paying respects to Anita Bose Pfaff and talk in brief about his thoughts on Netaji. I feel very proud that today we are also joined by my gurus, my teachers from Allahabad University 35 years back. I would like to mention and pay respects to Professor R.C. Tripathi, whom I wished earlier, and others from the Allahabad University. As I said, today is Netaji's 124th birth anniversary, which is being celebrated all over the world, of course, in India too. At the very outset, therefore, I feel Netaji's spirit, dedication, and lifelong commitment for India's independence. Start with a song. The popularity of INA songs proved music could move our spirits. So let's listen to a song composed by A.R. Rahman, beautifully penned by Javed Akhtar, from a Shyam Benegal film, Bose, the Forgotten Hero. It is being sung by Uttara Sukanya Joshi, who is a civil servant, a singer, and happens to be my daughter. Uttara.
Namaste, Jai Hind everyone. যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा। तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा। बोझ कितना हो मुश्किलों का मगर ना झुका है, ना झुक सकेगा ये सर, जिंदा फिर भी रहेगा मेरा ज़मीन, जिस्म को मौत भी आ जाए अगर, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा। যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না সে তবে একলা চলো রে, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। बाजी पे लगाने की खातिर हम जान हथेली पर लाए, बाजी पे लगाने की खातिर हम जान हथेली पर लाए, अब चाहे जिए अब चाहे मरे, जो होना है वो हो जाए, अब चाहे जिए अब चाहे मरे, जो होना है वो हो जाए, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। मंजिलें कभी क्या मिलेगी हमें, होगी क्या सहल कभी जो राह है कड़ी, आज हर जवाब हमको मिल जाएगा, आ गई है आज फैसले की घड़ी, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, तन्हा राही अपनी राह चलता जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा, अब तो जो भी होगा देखा जाएगा, देखा जाएगा, देखा जाएगा, देखा जाएगा, देखा जाएगा।
Thank you. Muted claps we can afford to give her. Thank you very much, Uttara, for making it alive. We can all feel the goosebumps and the spirit of Netaji. Thank you. May I now invite my friend Suhas Khale, the founder and chair of Netaji Subhas Foundation, London, to welcome Anita. Suhas.
First of all, thanks, Uttara, for, as usual, a melodious song appropriate to this program. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome on this 124th birth anniversary of Subhas Chandra Bose, a very charismatic, vibrant, and inspiring personality of the national freedom movement of India, who was born in 1897 at Cuttack. Thanks to Lalit Mohan Joshi and Kusing Joshi for organizing this event. Both of them have been active and constructive members of Netaji Subhas Foundation, called NSF. My special thanks to my friends Anita Bose, daughter of this formidable personality, and her husband Martin for finding time to contribute to this event. So why are we talking about this remarkable man on his 124th birth anniversary? Churchill once famously said that history is going to be kind to me as I am going to write it. After the World War II, the history has been written by the British and the Indian supporters of Congress Party who fought with the Allies. In the process, they have marginalized and distorted the role of Subhash Bose in the struggle for the Indian independence. By some of them, he was presented as a fascist and a troublemaker. So that is why I think today it is important that we talk about finding out what exactly was Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Bose was a man far way ahead of his time. His views were formulated and tempered by his struggle for independence at home and his intense interactions with Irish and Labour politicians. Detractors of Bose have portrayed him as a pro-fascist leader who fought with the Japanese and against the British during the Second World War. However, others at the best have seen him as a nationalist leader who led the Indian National Army and fought a war of independence against an imperial power. What is not known about Subhash Chandra Bose? That he was a strategic planner, a visionary, a democrat, an economic planner, and administrator. Above all, he was a man with a clear concept of equal opportunities for all, irrespective of caste, religion, gender, etc. Above all, Suhas was a great pragmatist who practiced what he preached. His speeches and writings of the pre-war period as a leading statesman, in his speech at the Maharashtra Provincial Conference in Pune on 3rd May 1928, Bose said about his vision of free India, quote, "Privileges based on birth, creed, and caste should go. And equal opportunities should be thrown open to all irrespective of creed, caste, and privilege," unquote. His speeches as the prominent leader of the Indian National Congress, as well as the proclamations during the war, as the Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army, addressed most of the critical issues highlighted above. He had considered many problems which independent India could face, and given the multilingual society, he even thought of a common language and script. He was totally committed to the idea of full independence from the then India. He was a socialist who wanted to transform the country into a modern and secular national state through intensive political, economic, and cultural reforms. He was committed to equality of all workers, peasants, and women. Secularism was a basic tenet of his philosophy. They were not just his thoughts and slogans, but he was committed to it. Later on, when he took over the Indian National Army, he put them into practice. There was a women's regiment named after Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, which was most uncommon those days. We are talking so many years back. He also sat and ate food in the canteen with all the INA members, men and women, Hindus, which are including Dalits, who were called untouchables now, Muslims, Sikhs, and all other religions. So he was practicing what he was preaching. Now, why we created NSF? I mean, what was the need 20 years ago? We created that in the year 2000, and it was dissolved last year in 2020. Some of us wanted to put across correct historical facts about Subhash Bose and his immense contribution to the Indian independence struggle. Prominent amongst them was the socialist thinker, writer, and historian Pradeep Bose, nephew of Subhash Chandra Bose. He was the spirit behind Netaji Subhas Foundation, which was created in the year 2000. To my surprise, Pradeep wanted me to work with him to form this foundation. It was a big ask, as in the political climate in the UK, and even to that great degree in India, the opinion generally about Subhash was that he was a supporter of fascism. So what inspired us to form this organization was to put across factual information about this dynamic, honest, secular man with socialist principles in the public domain as much as possible. We approached Anita, who is present here kindly today, for her support, and she kindly agreed to be the chief guest. And at a meeting at my home, it was decided that we'll go ahead with the project of launching NSF. To our great surprise, the launch at the Nehru Center was success. NFS was dissolved last year. I don't want to take much more time. I just want to just briefly tell you about what NSF's mission was, and I'm not getting into the objectives and all other things at the moment. We were trying to understand what was the vision and philosophy and dream and plans of Subhash Chandra Bose, looking at it and how far they were applicable in the current situation of the 21st century, and which we found they were. And so we were trying to put across and draw lessons from the struggle of freedom for his people regarding political, social, and economic bondage, and trying to put across the correct historical information about him through a number of meetings, programs, etc. I will just end by giving some idea about significant meetings of NHS, because we put across a lot of discussions, films, and programs. One was about Subhash Bose's ideology and its relevance today, where Professor Tapan Raj Chaudhary and Anita spoke. The other was about Subhash Bose, his life, activities, and ideas by Pradeep Bose. Then there was a women's equality session, women's equality in South Asia by late Supriya Sengupta, who was herself a member of Rani Jhansi Brigade during the INA days. Then there was Enemy of the Empire by Charles Bruce. This is a very, very good film, actually, about Subhash Bose. Finally, of course, there were, apart from many other programs in the 20 years, there was an interview with Anita Bose by Lalit Mohan Joshi, and I'm really, really pleased that you'll be able to listen. He will be able to interview her again today. And now, on this note, I think I will pass you on, because all of you are not waiting for what I was going to speak, but you're waiting for the interview with Anita. So, Lalit, can you please take over from here? And thank you once again for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Suhas, for your very elaborate and whatever you said is about NSF, which kept the Netaji, fire burning amongst us for the last 20 years. And thank you very much for that. So I now go to our main program with Anita, and I would like to share screen just to go for a short PowerPoint. So I just, Anita Bose Pfaff was born in Vienna, Austria in 1942 as a daughter of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and Amelie Schenkel. She lived in Vienna with her mother and her maternal grandmother until the completion of her law studies and her wedding in 1965. She married Martin Pfaff, PhD, whom she had met surprisingly during her first visit to India. Martin had 4 years as social worker in a school for the blind in Whitefield near Bangalore. After their wedding, the couple moved to the United States of America. In the US, she continued with postgraduate studies in economics and statistics. Martin was on the faculty of the School of Business Administration at American University in Washington, Michigan State University, and as full professor at Wayne State University. Anita became assistant professor at Wayne State University in 1969. In 1971, moved to Germany, where both joined University of Augsburg as professors on economics. She retired in 2008. She is author of several books and scientific on social policy and health economics. Anita and her husband have 2 sons, Peter Arun and Thomas Krishna, and 1 daughter, Maya Karina, and 5 grandchildren. They both enjoy being great parents. So this is slide 2. This is a conversation I had with her in 2015. Netaji's charming image provided by Anita from her private album, Netaji talking to Nehru during the freedom struggle. Both had agreements and serious disagreements. That's Netaji in the midst of his, Netaji in discussion with Gandhiji. He had great respect for him, but he did not agree with Mahatma on political strategy of complete non-violence. That's Netaji in the midst of his brainchild, the Indian National Army, first set up in 1942. Very interesting. It is reported that in Germany, around 12 million stamps were released in 1943 by Netaji's Azad Hind, gummed and kept ready for use when freedom came from the British. We will ask Anita in a short while. Netaji's wife, Amelie Schenkel Bose, with their only child, Anita, who is with us today. Anita with her husband, Professor Martin Pfaff. The photograph had been taken, obviously, in India. She is younger. With President late Pranab Mukherjee receives first copy of a book on Netaji from his daughter. The book was Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and Germany, edited by Anand Singh Bawa, in which Anita has contributed a chapter. That's the end of our, thankfully, the PowerPoints. I'll stop here. So welcome, Anita, once again. It's great to meet you after 5 years. And I remember that conversation Do you remember that?
Yes, I certainly do. Jai Hind to all of you, and thank you for having me for this event. I fondly remember our discussion or your interview with me a few years ago in London, and of course at that time it was still easy to go to London. Now, of course, with Brexit, Europe is cut off, so it may be difficult to see you soon again.
Your resemblance with your father, Netaji, is so striking. Do you have people who say so to you?
Yes, everybody does. Of course, one can never recognize that oneself. But even when I was a young child, my mother used to say so. And then when I met my uncle Sharad Bose for the first time, I think he was also quite taken in by the resemblance.
When did you first become conscious that you were a daughter of a great leader who was revered in India and all over the world?
I'm not quite sure. Probably during the visit of my uncle Sharad, I was about 6 at the time, or maybe even later. India started having diplomatic representation in all countries, and somewhere in the late 1940s, must have been 49 probably, or even 1950. There was a representation in Vienna as well, a legation at the time, and in connection with that, we also started having functions for my father's birthday, and I think this sort of brought home the idea that he was an important person even for people who had not met him.
You may have been hardly 2 or 3 when he had to go from Germany. Have you had some motivating stories about your father from your mother? Would you like to narrate 1 or 2?
No, I was only about 2 or 3 months when he left from Germany, because
Oh,
he left in 1943, and I was about 2 or 3 when he died. But well, of course, see, my mother in a way was a very private person. She did, she, particularly when I was a child, she would tell some stories, but more the stories that you would tell a child of episodes or something. But by and large, she was sort of withdrawn, and even when my niece Madhuri would ask her about some things, or my cousins, or my my daughter, she would say, "Oh, that's none of your business. This is my private affair."
when was the first time, Anita, you visited India, the land of your father?
I was 18 in 1960.
So what was the impact, and how did you receive all those relatives
Well,
and
it
freedom
was
fighters?
of course the majority of my family and of the people of Bengal and of India were very welcoming and enthusiastic. There were some few who were not, who sort of because they did not accept me as the daughter of my father, and in fact somebody announced that they would have a black flag demonstration when I came to Kolkata, but somehow that didn't come about. They didn't have the black flag demonstration, at least not where
Who
I
were
could
these
see
people?
it.
I'm curious to know, who were these people? Who
Oh, all sorts of people, including one of my cousins. And you see, the funny thing is, sometimes these ideas are sort of handed down through generations. My father said so, so I have to do the same thing. It's really quite amazing that somehow some people don't feel that they have to think for themselves. That what their fathers said should be enough, even though the fathers may have had a state of information which was very premature and limited at the time.
What was the, as a child, when you became conscious of Netaji, was there any kind of psychological about the life of your parents not being very, very, long? Hardly, I think they were together. I think earlier you had said to me that if you count them in terms of time, it would be hardly 2 or 3 years that they were together. Although in 1934, your mother was married and Subhash left Germany probably in 43.
It was indeed very little, because I mean they met in 1934, and as you just mentioned, he left Germany in 1943, and of course in between he had spent many years in India, so there was not too much time. I think the longest period of time was in fact after he had escaped from Kolkata via Afghanistan and the Soviet Union to Germany. And in Germany, they were together about a year and a half, or well, from April 1941 to February 1943. And during the 30s, it was always sort of a few months or maybe a half a year or something, because he kept going back and forth between India and Germany as far as it was possible.
Right. I think Netaji as a child was a difficult child, and it is very ironical that a man of that vision, who encompassed a real India, a real secular India, although it was his own interpretation of secularism, had Bose been in India, maybe partition would not have taken place. So how do you look into his early life and the impact that made him the kind of leader that he became?
That may sound strange, but to some extent, of course, the circumstances. He was a very shy child, and I think when he was a child, he really sort of felt rather insignificant, being the 9th child in a large family of 14. Of course, that's maybe not that surprising, because all the elders are sort of have a more dominant role to play, and very often it's the siblings who have close ties. And of course, Saurabh Bose and his second oldest brother and he were very close indeed. In fact, I think for my uncle, my father was almost more important than his children. And he was the one who sort of saw the potential and the future in his younger brother. You sort of mentioned that my father was a difficult child. As a mother, I must say he must, to some extent, he must have been rather exasperating. Just imagine when he was 14, or thereabouts, he would sneak out of the house to go and tend to the cholera patients, and then sneak back into the house. I think as a mother, particularly with many other children around, you would not be precisely overjoyed if one of your children did that. Then one fine day, he took off to the Himalayas or somewhere to find a guru, and was not heard of for quite some time.
What was his age at that time?
Oh, he was a teenager. He was really quite young. I'm not quite sure about that, but if I sort of try to infer what my grandfather must have thought, he might also have been less than convinced that what the son was doing was all that smart, because I think the older generation at that time sort of was a bit more moderate in terms of what they wanted in terms of independence. So I think when his son sort of went ahead full-fledged into the independence movement, and before that, of course, as I mentioned, into religion and philosophy, he might have had his doubts, and I mean, after all, it was not that easy to send a son to study for the ICS, and it was expensive. And then this son after getting the offer of a position, decides to resign. So I think if a parent is also thinking of the economic well-being, he must have thought this boy is totally out of his mind. And I've talked to some people who were also in the ICS, and one man once told me, he said, well, I passed the ICS exam 10 years after your father did. And when I was a student, I was very impressed with the fact that he resigned from the ICS, but then I didn't have it in me to do the same.
He resigned from ICS. That's a very good point. I mean, did he resign because of the impact of Jallianwala Bagh, or did he resign because he just wanted to prove a point to his parents that he could be an ICS, but that's not the thing that he wants to do?
No, he resigned because as an ICS officer, he had to sign some papers which, in essence, in his opinion, sort of downgraded the Indian population. And he felt that he was not going to treat his countrymen with this sort of condescending attitude, which the British, of course, had towards them. And the ICS, in a way, was the handle of the British in the administration of the country. He was rather uncompromising in that way. And of course, he could have also, I think, resigned after going back to India, but he resigned right away. And I think that meant that his father and his brother had to pay for his education, if I'm not mistaken. And otherwise, if he had resigned later, at least I think they wouldn't have had to bear the costs of that. So in any number of ways, he was rather unusual. And I think he was a very favorite uncle with his younger nephews and nieces, and they found him far more accessible than they found their own fathers very often. But by and large, I think he sort of was very single-minded in his dedication to his country. And
I mean, Anitaji, he was so much committed and dedicated and focused. And he, in fact, he was the leader who probably started referring to Mahatma Gandhi as father of the nation, if I'm not wrong. But being in the Congress, being so popular, because I think, although you're an economist, but you have got a very good view of concept of history. What do you think, according to you, did not gel between Subhas and Nehru and Gandhi? And why did Gandhi appear to have taken side of Nehru to oust Bose?
Well, you see, in some ways, of course, Pandit Nehru and my father had similar ideas. I mean, they were both leftists. They were both, for those days, modern, and had more socialist ideas. They were more secular or they had the idea of India as a modern and secular country, which, of course, particularly the idea of modern was not precisely what Gandhi had in mind. But it is my impression that Gandhi, even though at the time he did not formally hold an office in the Congress Party, in essence, dictated what was to be done. And ultimately, when it came to the decisions, Nehru would always sort of buckle under, even though he had different ideas maybe, whereas my father did not. He had his ideas, and I think there was one point where they differed very strongly, and where indeed possibly Nehru and was more on his thoughts were more along Gandhi's thoughts. They were non-compromising towards the fascist powers, and my father was non-compromising towards the British. And when it came to, or maybe in Gandhi's case, it was also non-compromising with respect to non-violence. So he did not approve of the idea of trying to gain independence also by military means. And for Nehru, I think any compromise with the Axis powers was not acceptable. On the other hand, that section of Congress and Gandhi sort of were, as far as I know, were more accommodating towards the British at the beginning of World War II, because of their opposition to the Germans and later on the Japanese. And in a way sort of said, well, let's support the war and the British in any case, provided they will grant independence to India after they are victorious. And the idea of compromising with the British was unacceptable for my father.
So that was the point which made him decide to leave it all in India and leave and go abroad for getting support for what he wanted to do.
Yeah. Also, the other thing is the whole Congress leadership was imprisoned very often, and he felt that being imprisoned, he couldn't do anything. So that was the reason why he went abroad. And in fact, when the Quit India movement started, the whole Congress leadership was imprisoned again, and they couldn't do anything. So there was a point in that he was able to act maybe in a different and more limited way from abroad, but at least he was free to send radio messages and things like that. And then, of course, it turned out that being stationed in Europe was not very helpful, and he was able to move to the Far East and take command of the Indian National Army.
How do you see his very, very risky and adventurous escape to outside India? The fact that I have read that Britishers were also trying to get him assassinated.
Yes, that's interesting. I think by chance, a document turned up in connection with a totally different kind of research. I think some research concerning Turkey. And somebody found a document there which stated that they had thought he would be passing through Turkey, and they wanted to have him assassinated there. I think he was probably one of the best hated people for the British rulers, and so it's not surprising that they were not very fond of him, because he was a very uncompromising opponent to His Majesty, to paraphrase the title of a book.
So that's brings us to the next phase of Netaji. But we want to take a little break, and because one of our members, Alka Mahapatra, she wants to offer you a dance which is choreographed in one of the INA songs, and she lives in London and actively involved in our activities. She is presenting this dance, Kadam Kadam Badhaya Ja. She has choreographed it with basic Odissi steps. Alka, can you come and show your performance?
Can you guys hear me? And
Yeah,
can I
we can.
you just mute their mics, please? Thank you.
Okay, I will.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. So muted applause for Alka. So let me come back to the remaining conversation. This is a question I want to ask you, that why did Subhash Chandra Bose thought it would be beneficial to meet Hitler? And his meeting with Hitler is often discussed. And what did he achieve by it? Or he didn't achieve anything? I would like to know from you, Anitaji.
Well, my father tried to get the Axis powers to commit themselves to a so-called India statement or India commitment, meaning to say that they would commit to the fact that they would support the independence of India after Second World War. And Hitler was a racist. He was also a racist versus the Indians, and the reason why he he, or rather his regime, had supported my father was that at one stage they expected to sort of be victorious in Northern Africa in the military offensive, and eventually maybe proceed towards the east, towards India. And in that case, say an Indian support would have been of advantage. But the German Reich sort of dilly-dallied all along and would not go along. The Italians were also sort of evasive and said, well, if the Germans went along, they would also. So this, in a way, they sort of hosted him and supported him. But politically speaking, not much sort of developed. By the way, sort of on an anecdotal basis, his main liaison and contact in Germany, in the Foreign Office, was a man named Adam von Trotzu-Solz. And I don't know, those of you who know something about the history of Germany of those days, he was later involved in the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, and which unfortunately did not succeed. And Adam von Trotzu-Solz was one of the four who were executed on account of that. I'm not sure to what extent the Foreign Office or von Trotzu-Solz interest in India had something to do with opposition to the Nazi regime. But it is interesting that you have this coincidence there. So anyway, my father tried to get an appointment with Hitler, which took quite some time, and hoped to sort of present his cause to him personally and get his support. And the meeting with Hitler was not very successful, to put it mildly. But Hitler committed himself that he would support my father to reach East Asia. And so the idea was then, because at that time Japan had been victorious in many areas, and Japan was willing to support India, because after all, through Raj Bihari Bose, they had also supported the freedom movement of the Indians there, the Indian National Army, which already existed. And
at least he gave Subhash a passage, a safe passage to leave that place.
Passage. It luckily turned out to be somewhat safe, but it was exceedingly perilous at the time. In fact, first they thought of sort of getting him to Southeast Asia by plane, but then somehow there was concern that this plan had been sort of leaked to the British, and so the submarine which took him to near Madagascar was a very new modern development at the time, because normally it would have been very difficult to cover these distances with a submarine, and that in a war theater on top of that. In fact, I happened to meet one of the petty officers of that submarine later, and he talked about this very perilous journey which they had with regard to British ships in the area, storms in the area, and so on. So it certainly was not a comfortable and easy journey to travel in a submarine at that time.
Professor Anita, just one more question about this meeting. Is it true that Hitler made certain comments about India which were very derogatory.
Yeah.
And Subhash Chandra Bose was frank enough to tell him off for it, when the meeting was going on.
Yeah, he did, and he also asked him to sort of change some of the passages in his book Mein Kampf, and
Bose asked him, oh,
which probably was
Subhash Bose asked him.
not the most polite thing to do, but so I mean, Nazi Germany was sort of well, didn't support the Indian independence movement wholeheartedly, let's put it that way, but they supported the establishment of an Indian Legion, and which, however, never got to be fighting on any front, as far as I know, because my father insisted that they would not be sent to the Eastern Front vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but only against the British, and that didn't occur during that period. So
salutes to your father, who had the guts to tell Hitler to change certain things in Mein Kampf. That is something unbelievable. What a man he was. Probably the best leader India saw. Now, I want to know from you, according to you, what was the vision of Subhash Bose if he had succeeded in returning and getting independence as he wanted? If he had become the leader rather than Nehru, what would have been his economic policy?
Well, of course, we can only speculate what would have been. I mean, he had some ideas, and in a way, you could say he had a blueprint in mind, which, of course, was a very general blueprint of what India should be. He definitely wanted India to be a secular state, and he did not want India to be partitioned. So I think if he had lived in 1947 and experienced the mayhem of the partition, he would have been absolutely frustrated and
So, Anitaji, you are saying in a way that when independence came and partition became inevitable, and even Nehru wanted partition to go ahead, and Gandhi was the only leader who was tooth and nail opposing partition, and he said that over my dead body. So if Subhash was there at that point of time, you think that Subhash and Gandhi would have put their foot down and no way the partition could have happened and the tragedy ensuing?
I'm not sure whether he could have prevented it, but he certainly would have been one person to side with Gandhi on that issue. And it is a bit tragic if you think of it, for Gandhi, who had sort of dictated what Congress did up to very late in the mid-40s. And then when the decision came to set India free, so to say, but to partition India, he was left alone, and they all were interested in getting independence some way or the other, even at the cost of partition. Maybe some even welcomed it. And he couldn't get the others to come around to his position. So if my father had been around, maybe the two of them might have helped to negotiate something else. I'm certainly sure that the Muslim leadership would have trusted him far more than they trusted the Congress leadership otherwise.
Isn't that ironical that Netaji had such a good rapport with all communities? And if you see INA, most of his lieutenants were Muslims, and Muslims were so much gelled with that they were ready to give their lives. And if, but I have got another point, that if Subhash would have become the leader in India, because he was very, very controlling, because he believed and did what he wanted to do. So you think, sorry for asking this question, would he have veered towards becoming a benevolent despot, or you think that with Nehru around, they would have had a proper democracy? This is a hypothetical question.
Hard to say. He might have veered towards that, but you might say, of sorts, Nehru, even though formally he was of course the head of a democratic state, he had sort of quasi dictatorial powers, just on the basis of his personality and the position he held. I think my father would have done some things in a similar way and others differently. Whether that would have benefited India more, whether corruption would have been less, whether a war with Pakistan could have been prevented, we can only speculate.
Right, right.
Because I mean, in many ways, Nehru was a very successful politician as far as international politics were concerned. I think he certainly contributed to sort of gaining a prominent position for India in the non-aligned bloc. But on the other hand, he also sort of vacillated sometimes and didn't commit himself to. And if he had possibly taken a stronger stand, some problems might have been prevented later on. I'm just thinking of Kashmir in that direction. But that is mute. We can only speculate what might have been. I'm certain that India would not have been the paradise on earth, even if my father had been the head. I mean, the problems the country had to face would have been just as severe as they were, and maybe they might have placed different emphasis, but
it would have been better. India would have been better.
It might have been a little different, but I don't know whether some problems could be avoided, and of course many could also not be foreseen. I mean, you never have full foresight in what would happen after 20, 30 years, how the world develops.
It's a very
that education would have been better, but even that is not certain.
I would like to ask you 2-3 more questions, because I'm tempted to, because I want, I know people may like to have some questions. And my question is, recently after Modi came to power, which is a right-wing party, they have gone in for what do they call, opening
deregulation,
documentation. Yeah. So how do you see it? It has happened a couple of years back, and then Modi government still talks about it, and Chandra Bose is also trying to liaise with it. How do you see that process?
Are you talking about declassification or what?
Declassification. I was not declassification. That's the word I was.
Yeah. Well, I think it was
forgetting.
It was overdue. I mean, not only referring to the documents about my father, but I mean, there were some documents which were to be kept under lock and key, I think, for 75 years or something, supposedly because some international interests were concerned. I can't imagine what would have to be kept under lock and key for 75 years. It doesn't make any sense. But in any case, some who were interested in under the right to information law movement were interested in the classification, expected some juicy tidbits about God knows what conspiracy and that. I never did, and of course there wasn't anything in it. But I think as a matter of principle, for historical purposes, these should be declassified. And I didn't look at all of the documents because the download time was very long for these documents. But I mean, some were rather uninteresting, really tried things. But for example, I was somewhat, all in our members of our family were somewhat surprised and taken aback to find out that some members of our family were spied upon by the government of Free India, I think well into the 60s.
That happened during
Well, ask yourself who was
time.
the ruler at the time. And not only the central government, also the Bengal government. So evidently there were some who were a bit afraid that, say, they might sort of use the old INA networks and so on to do something, or I don't know what they expected, but or maybe it was just keeping on with the old British tradition. Nobody cancelled the order and they continued to spy. I don't know. But
what do you make of this this whole theory that Netaji was the Baba, the sage, and some people are sort of really strongly. So I would like to have your thoughts on that. The ashes of Netaji being brought from a temple in Japan. But first on Netaji being a sadhu and not speaking out who he is.
It's absolutely ridiculous. And in fact, it's quite insulting to him. Just imagine the person he was. He would go back to India, sort of sneak into India secretly, live behind a curtain, and not involve himself in the Indian affairs, not even be in touch with anyone in his family. And it's just outrageous. But of course, one can make good money writing about it. It makes for a good spy story or the thriller or whatever. I think it's outrageous.
What do you think about Netaji's, ashes in Japanese temple? And there was a time when Mr. Bajpayee went there and he had some incense stick there. And I think, do you think that those should be brought to India? What is your thought?
Yes, I think they should be, but I would agree that we should first have the two governments and the temple renew their agreement, because there was a past agreement which was somehow hidden in the Mukherjee report, the appendices, the documents, which they are quite interesting. They had agreed in principle to a DNA test, and the commissioner Mukherjee kept asking for the same thing over again, although they had already agreed to it. And then surprisingly, they put it into the appendix of the report, a Japanese letter from the temple agreeing to the DNA test, and there was a translation which omitted that paragraph. It was a bit strange. But anyway, for the sake of those people who doubt that these are his remains, but who are capable of thinking rationally, I would want to have an attempt at least to make a DNA test. We don't know whether DNA will be able to, one would be able to extract DNA, because he was cremated and the bones may have been too badly charred. But if it could be done, we should try that, and that hopefully will put to rest some of the arguments. I mean, there are some crazies who won't believe it anyway, but believing in lies is not only a monopoly of India. You find that in other parts of the world too, as we well know, even recently. And in fact, I think it would be very nice if we could sort of bring the remains back to India in the course of this coming year, but let's wait and see. I personally would welcome a closure on the issue.
I would definitely agree with that, Anita. That's a wonderful chat. And I just want to ask one more question. That's the last question. Today, India is so much divided between the right and left, and there is so much of communalism. What are your thoughts? Had your father been there, what would you say the present state of India? Although I did say in the beginning that this program is apolitical, but I'm tempted to ask this question.
Well, he certainly would not have been around now under any circumstances. I mean, I doubt any one of you would imagine that it would be easy for a person like Netaji to live to be 124. But and even if he had lived as a senile old man to that ripe age, or a wise old man to that ripe age, he would not have been active in politics, I'm sure. So I think the first few decades after independence, he probably would have involved himself in India's affairs. And maybe that would have provided a different basis for the future development in some walks of life. What would have happened now, we don't know, because say, if he had left politics in 1970 or 1980, we don't know what would have happened afterwards. A similar development might have taken place. Of course, we might speculate that the Indian people are good, that they are smart, that they are dedicated, that they would be better, and they were only corrupted by circumstances in some ways. But I would not venture to predict that for certain.
Thank you so much, Anita, for accepting all my questions and being so kind. I really appreciate that. Before I take one or two questions, many people from social life, and we have got Viren Sharma, who is a member of parliament from South Hall. In fact, I would like to give him this opportunity to have his say, either ask a question or any statement that he would like to give. Virenji.
Just give me an opportunity to say thank you to you, and also to the other participants in this conference. I hope we didn't bore them too much.
No, I think they all enjoyed, because we have got the record attendance. Nearly 100 people attending the Zoom. So many people from outside. So, yes, Virenji.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi. And it's a pleasure to listen to Mrs. Bose or Anitaji once again after a few years. It's a pleasure to hear your understanding of the not only Mr. Subhas Chandra Bose's how he would see, but certainly interpreting Bose's vision for the future. As myself from India, who studied history and read Subhas Chandra Bose in not the level I would now like to see, that his vision for the future, not only fighting against the British rule, but certainly what kind of the society he would like to see after India's independence. His INA's structure indicates clearly his vision for the women in the society united India with no place for discrimination on the basis of caste, color, creed, religion. And I think that that message, we need to take it around today, that if Subhashji was the prime minister or the one of the leaders after India's independence, certainly everybody believes that we would have a different administration and the implementation of the Indian constitution differently. He was definitely a secular, he was committed socialist, he believed in equality, he believed in unity, and I wish that we could bring the knowledge back to the society and hopefully Indian government. And I'm glad to say that today India is celebrating all over the places, not only in the UK, but in India. I think it's the first prime minister who has gone to West Bengal to celebrate his 124th birthday. I wish that we can bring that awareness and educate the future generations about Subhash Chandra Bose as equally as to on Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru. Once again, Anitaji, wonderful to hear you. And I hope that we will have other opportunities to listen to you. And I'm sure Mr. Joshi and his team will carry on bringing this subject more and more so that people will be more aware and also educated. Thank you very much for asking me to come today. Thank you, Mr. Joshi.
Thank you very much, Viren Sharmaji. I would like to give an opportunity to another senior friend and veteran broadcaster, one who has a great concept of history, Yawar Abbas, who is 100 this year. And I would like to give him an opportunity to have his say in brief. Yawar Sahab, please.
Yes. All I have to say is that I mean, we're in the field of speculation as to what would have happened if Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose had been at the head of affairs, or at least present at the time of India's so-called independence. I'm sure that if he had been alive at the time, whether through his march to India with the INA or otherwise, if he had been alive, he would have done everything possible to avoid the partition of India and to see that there was really a secular India that would have taken shape, in which there would be no need to have Bangladesh or Pakistan, because India is itself now a broken country. It is not the country that Subhas Bose would have liked to have had. It is a broken country, and so is Bangladesh, and so is Pakistan.
Thank you. Thank you much, Yawar Sahab. That's a wonderful, very, very receptive comment. So now I would like to take at least 2 or 3 questions. If you guys can, any of you who can raise their hand, and I'll be very happy to take a question, and I'm sure Anita ji would like to answer them, and then we will go to John for a final sharing statement.
Hi, Anita ji. This is Jayashree Elliott from Dallas, Texas, and I'm so proud to be here talking to you through this platform, Zoom, brought to us by Shri Lalit ji from London. I have a question. My husband and I both are very interested in alternative history or counterfactual history, and I actually wrote this down. How do you think history might have been different if your father had prevailed in the internal struggles within the Congress Party, or if the British had been defeated and driven out of India by the German forces? What would India and world look like today?
Well, Joshi, thank you for your questions. Well, let me try to speculate on some of the things. Of course, speculations are always very subjective, and and of course, not really based on facts. Well, having lived in Germany, of course, I must say I'm glad that the Germans did not win the war, even though at one stage they sort of half-heartedly supported India. Because I think the world would not have been a better world if they had sort of
Absolutely.
been able to impose their racist ideas on large parts of Europe and the world at large. And ultimately, they also had been rather sort of half-hearted in their support of India, although there was a tradition of interest in India and Indian philosophy and culture in Germany all along, going back for centuries. I could only say I would hope that the example of a leader who really showed integrity and dedication would have prevented some of the more negative developments in India. I must say, in some ways, India had a positive development. I mean, you mentioned before that India was a broken country, not you, but Yavaji. I don't want to sound prejudiced, but if you look at the political situation, India is relatively stable, has more or less maintained a democratic system. Of course, the test is that if governments can change through elections, which even in America is not always obvious of late. So India has sort of managed reasonably well. Also economically, there was progress and all that. Of course, there are many things that are not good. The position of women, as I had mentioned before, etc. But Pakistan and Bangladesh are in far worse positions. I would say partly also, of course, due to the vicinity to Afghanistan. Pakistan, to some extent, is a failed state. And it's most unfortunate that they cannot manage to control the entirety of their country. And of course, Bangladesh is a very poor and even by international standards, a very corrupt state. And so, of course, India could also be better in that respect. I mean, corruption is widespread there too, and I could only hope that if my father had been around, it would be less so. I'm not blue, as in German we would say blue-eyed. I mean, naive enough to imagine that he could have prevented everything bad and everything vicious and everything corrupt in India. He certainly couldn't have, but maybe he could have escaped being drawn into this field, which I think to some extent happened to the Indian leadership. I would certainly not claim that the leadership as such was highly corrupt. But corruption is not only a question of how the top echelon behaves, but it is something that permeates the whole society and the whole system. I mean, of course, a good example makes a difference. If as a simple person you see that your superiors cheat and are corrupt, then you say, why should I not be corrupt too? But let me just add one more thing, since you live in Texas. Isn't it thrilling that a woman of Indian descent is the vice president?
That's very well said. Thank you very much for your question, Jayashree, and for your answer.
Thank you, Lalitji. And thank you, Dr. Bose.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
so
can
much.
only take one more question, but I have to go to John for the final statement. Anybody wanting to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Yes, Lalit. I want to ask one question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Professor Anita Bose. What is your impressions about the steps being taken by Modi government in India regarding this Subhash Bose legacy to be put prominently? What do you think, the present thing? And this today's days he has announced at Parakram Divas.
Well, first of all, I'm fairly certain that the Indian leadership, be it in Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, or at the top of the central government, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, are genuine admirers of my father, that they respect him and all that. I don't think this is just pretense about Mamata Ji, I know, but I'm fairly sure that for Narendra Modi, it's also not just a show. But on the other hand, it's quite obvious that since Bengal elections will be on later this year, there is also political interest in doing that. But having been in politics on a very sort of minor level, I also understand enough that ahead of an election, parties have to find every excuse to sort of address the public with different topics. So I'm sure there is a political interest too. Frankly speaking, I don't understand the argument of why there is disagreement about what you call that divas, whether that's Desh Prem or whatever. All these terms which they use, or Deshanayak for that matter, which Tagore had used, all these terms apply to my father, that he loved his country, that he was a leader of his country, that he was fearless and all that. So I would welcome if they could honor him jointly, but if that is not to be, which ahead of an election probably would be asking too much, a competition how to honor him better is the second best solution.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Raji Srivastava, and answer, Anita ji. I'm afraid we want to go on and on, but I know Anita ji has to go. I would like to invite John Eid for his statement as a chair. Before that, I would like to thank everyone who have helped me in this, in making it possible. Especially, I thank Suhas. It was I gave this idea to him, and it was he who helped me to fructify this. And I also thank Kusum, my wife, for helping me out all through this conversation, and my daughter, and all those who have helped me. John, you are most welcome to come and make your statement. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yes, John.
Good. Okay. Well, first, yes, thank you very much indeed, Anita. Fascinating talk, and Lalit and Kusum and Uttara and Aka for a wonderful blend of personal and political and musical and poetry. So what I liked about this session was that it wasn't just a kind of rather dry discussion, which it could have easily been. Of course, I'm rather nervous because I'm the only English guy here. And so there's a kind of a temptation to be set up because clearly Netaji's life and heritage is deeply personal and emotional one for Indians. So I feel as though I'm a bit in the lion's den here. And also I'm an anthropologist, although my first research was done in Calcutta and in London with Bengali settlement in London. And they're two of my Bengali colleagues who've come to attend here. So I have obviously some expertise, but I'm not an historian. But so I just wanted to make just a few comments, both personal and political. I thought what was interesting, and I was reading Mihir Bose's book, you know, which is Raj Secret's Revolution. And what comes across there, I suppose, is the phrase love conquers all. That is, I think your story is about how love can transcend distance, can transcend history, can transcend racial division and cultural division. Mihir Bose in his book mentions that quite a few Indians were scandalized by the idea that your father should have a child from someone who is not Indian. So in a way, your life is an example of the way we live in today's world, where we do have all kinds of mixtures across these divides, and how important that is, you know, that we're not simply entrenched in our own little bubbles, even though we're in lockdown and we're supposed to be in bubbles, but, you know, but more broadly, that we can reach out across these divisions. I think that comes across very strongly. Secondly, I thought what was very interesting, your point about thinking for yourself. And clearly your father was someone who exemplified that. And again, as we know, and as you say quite rightly, it's very hard to do that because one has to defy, as you say, family stories, all kinds of traditions that are held deeply personally. And so that made a big impact on me. So those were, if you like, two personal comments. And the third one actually is personal, but it refers to partition. And as Mihir Bose points out at the end of his book, the British, which of course I'm British, but you know, I'm not British in the 1920s British. I'm a product of the post-colonial, decolonized world. But the British obviously had the example of the partition of Ireland, 1922. And I, as a Catholic, English Catholic, have this kind of awareness of the deep antagonism towards the Catholic Church that has faded, thank goodness. But there was almost a kind of racial prejudice against the Irish in the British social elite, which thank goodness has declined a lot, but still very powerful. So anyway, I think, and when I was in India meeting Bengali Muslims to interview them about their identity, they asked me, well, what are you doing here? You know, well, why have you come here? Are you MI6, you know, MI5, you know, are you a spy, basically? And, you know, well, it's you can see why people thought that, you know, it does seem a rather crazy project that I was doing. But I was saying, well, actually, you know, I'm a Catholic, and India was partitioned very much on the model of Ireland in 1922. So that connection is a very strong one, and I think Radcliffe, who did the you know, the division of Bengal, I think he was using the model of the 1922 partition of Ireland, and I don't know if he was involved in it himself, but anyway, so there was a model there, if you like, sorry, so that was my third point, and I think my last point was well, I think two more points. One is this desire to believe in conspiracy theories, and how against all evidence people still hold to them. And we've seen this obviously in the whole Trump saga and the whole fake news stuff. So what intrigues me, I suppose, as a social scientist is the need that some people have, to believe even in the face of all kinds of evidence. Obviously the job that we have as academics is always to try and say, sorry, this is not true, this is not. And so finally, my last point, I think it's interesting, again, it links to, I think, what's happening globally, is that clearly, although India has many problems, India is increasingly emerging as a major global power, as power shifts from west to east, and has been for the last 20, 30 years. So in a sense, India has the kind of same problems that Britain had in the imperial period as America had in its imperial period. So it's going to be fascinating next 10 years to see how India becomes increasingly involved in global superpower politics, and to what extent can it not make the same mistakes that we've made in this country in handling our role as global superpower. So those are just some thoughts, but thank you again very much indeed, Anita. Thank you.
Yeah, I see. Anita ji, are you going to make a statement or before I close?
Well, thank you all the contributors to the discussion at the end, and of course, very much so the beautiful dance and the beautiful song by Yuto and Alka. And I must say the dance was more graceful than the march of either the INA or the present Indian military, who also, I think, have this song still in use.
Subhashi and me, we are from Kathak, like we both are from Kathak, so it's fun to dance and meet you and talk to you. Thank you.
She was born where Subhash ji was born. That's what she's saying.
Yes, yes. So we both have the same birthplace.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah.
That's why you were so excited for this dance. So I'm very happy you did very well, Alka, and thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone who were here today. We had a record audience, nearly 100 people, and it is all because of Anita, that people wanted to hear Subhash Chandra Bose's daughter. It was a rare opportunity for all Londoners, people from America, Canada, and all parts of India. Thank you so much. And I would like to also especially thank Amit Roy, who is a journalist, my friend, and especially thank Professor R.C. Tripathi, who has been my teacher. I pay respect to him, and I thank him for coming today and bringing other people from Allahabad University. And I obviously thank Martin and Suhas once again. So I would now like to close it because I'm aware that Anita has to go for another event. So Anita, please feel free to leave the meeting. Thank you so much.